If life was fair, then Zobiana would have been the princess of her father's house. She would have been wrapped in love, surrounded by kindness, and treated like the daughter of a wealthy man should be. But life was never fair to her. Zobiana was a bright and kind-hearted girl living in Lagos, Nigeria. Her father, Chief Obinna, was a respected businessman, known for his wealth and influence. To him, Zobiana was his greatest treasure, the daughter he loved more than anything. He had promised her a life of comfort, education, and security. But promises meant nothing to fate. When Zobiana was just 10 years old, her mother fell sick and passed away. Her warm hugs, her soft voice, and her protective presence disappeared, leaving Zobiana alone in a house that suddenly felt cold. Chief Obinna, lost in grief, made a decision that would change Zobiana's life forever. Within months, he remarried a woman named Nkiru. She was beautiful on the outside, but rotten on the inside. With her came her daughter, Zoma, a girl the same age as Zobiana, but with a heart filled with jealousy and cruelty. At first, everything seemed fine. Nkiru smiled sweetly, called Zobiana her little angel, and treated her as if she were her own daughter. Zoma acted like a new best friend, laughing with her, braiding her hair, and sharing secrets. But it was all an illusion. The moment the wedding was over, and Nkiru secured her place in the house, the masks came off. It started with small things. Zobiana, be a good girl, and bring me some water. Zobiana, clean up the plates. You know how clumsy the servants are. Zobiana, you should wake up earlier and help with breakfast. But small things grew bigger. The servants were dismissed one by one, and suddenly Zobiana was the only one left to do the cleaning, the cooking, the laundry. She was no longer the daughter of the house. She was a servant. Her father didn't notice. Nkiru was clever. She filled his ears with sweet words, distracting him with love and lies. Zobiana needs to learn responsibility, my love, she would say, stroking his arm. She's getting lazy, and I just want to teach her good habits. And Chief Obinna, trusting his wife, nodded in agreement. Zobiana's room was taken from her. Zoma needed a bigger space, Nkiru claimed, so Zobiana was moved to a tiny storage room near the kitchen. Her beautiful dresses were given to Zoma, and she was left with worn-out clothes. She was forced to wake up before sunrise, scrub floors, wash dishes, and serve food to the very people who stole her life. And every time she looked at her father, hoping he would notice, he only saw what Nkiru wanted him to see, a daughter who was learning discipline. Zobiana wanted to scream, to cry, to beg her father to see the truth. But she quickly learned that in this house, her voice didn't matter. She was just a shadow, a ghost in the home that once belonged to her. And the nightmare had only just begun. Zobiana used to believe that no matter how bad things got, her father would always protect her. But she didn't know how powerful lies could be, how words, when whispered in the right ears, could turn love into doubt, and doubt into distance. Nkiru was a master of manipulation. She didn't scream or shout. She didn't need to. She planted small, poisonous seeds in Chief Obinna's mind, day after day, watering them until they grew into thick walls between father and daughter. She disrespects me, she would sigh, shaking her head. I try so hard to love her, but she refuses to accept me. She doesn't listen, she would add, wiping fake tears from her eyes. I only want what's best for her, but she's so rebellious. She's getting lazy, she whispered one night. As Obinna sat tired from work, I worry about her future. Maybe we should teach her some responsibility. At first, Chief Obinna defended his daughter, but doubt is a dangerous thing. It doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to exist. Soon, he started noticing only what Nkiru wanted him to see. If Zobiana forgot to greet her stepmother in the morning, it was proof of her disrespect. If she looked tired after hours of scrubbing the floor, it was because she was lazy. If she flinched when Zobiana made a cruel remark, it was because she was being rude. And with every passing day, his warm gaze turned colder. Then, one morning, Nkiru made her boldest move. I think it's time we make a decision about Zobiana's education, she said over breakfast. Zobiana, dressed in her neat school uniform, smirked silently as she ate her meal, while Zobiana, standing nearby with a tray, froze. "What do you mean?" Chief Obina asked. "She's been struggling in school," Nikiru said, shaking her head. "Her teachers say she's not performing well. Maybe it's best if she stays home for a while, helps with the house and learns some skills." Zobiana's heart pounded. It was a lie. She had always been a top student, but Nikiru didn't care about that. She wanted her gone. Chief Obina hesitated, but then he sighed. "If you think it's best," he said, without even looking at Zobiana. And just like that, her future was stolen. The next day, Zobiana left for school in a shiny black car, heading to the best private academy in Lagos, while Zobiana stayed behind, scrubbing floors that would never be clean enough for her stepmother. Days turned into months, and Zobiana's world became smaller and smaller. She was no longer allowed to sit at the dinner table. She ate leftovers in the kitchen, sitting on a wooden stool. She was no longer allowed to wear nice clothes. Her dresses were passed down to Zobiana, while she wore old, faded rags. She was no longer allowed to speak unless spoken to. And her father, the man who once adored her, barely even looked at her anymore. Then everything changed again. One evening, Chief Obina came home feeling weak. He brushed it off, saying it was just stress, but his condition got worse. Soon, he was too ill to leave his bed. The house was filled with doctors, nurses, and whispers. Zobiana was not allowed near him. Every time she tried, Nikiru would push her away. "He needs rest," she would say. "He doesn't want to see you right now," she claimed. But Zobiana knew the truth. Nikiru wasn't letting her father talk to her because she was afraid that in his final moments, he would see through her lies. Afraid that he would try to fix the damage she had done. Then, one morning, the house was silent. Too silent. Zobiana stepped out of her small storage room, her heart heavy with dread. The air felt thick, suffocating. She walked through the hallway, her bare feet making no sound against the cold tiles. And then she saw them, Nikiru, Zobiana, and a few others, standing in the living room, their faces unreadable. Her father was gone. She wanted to cry, to scream, to fall to her knees and grieve, but there was no time for that. Nikiru took control immediately. The will was read, and just like that, everything that belonged to Chief Obina was handed over to her and Zobiana. Zobiana was left with nothing. "But, what about me?" she asked. Her voice barely a whisper. Nikiru smiled, the kind of smile that sent chills down the spine. "Oh, you still have a place here," she said sweetly. "Don't worry, dear, you won't be homeless." And that was how Zobiana became a full-time servant in her own house. There was no more pretending. Nikiru and Zobiana no longer played nice. They barked orders at her, laughed at her, treated her like she was less than human. If she ever dared to look them in the eye, they reminded her of her place. "You're nothing now," Zobiana sneered one evening, tossing a dirty plate at her feet. "You should be grateful we're letting you stay." At night, she curled up on the cold floor of the storage room, hugging herself for warmth, staring at the ceiling as tears slid down her face. She had no one, nowhere to go, no future, but as she lay there, something inside her refused to die. A small flickering flame, buried under pain and exhaustion, still burned. It whispered to her, reminding her of who she used to be. She was still Chief Obina's daughter. She was still smart, still strong, and no matter how much they tried to break her, she was not going to let them win. They thought she was finished, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Zobiana was supposed to disappear. That was what Nikiru and Zelma wanted, to turn her into a ghost in her own house, a shadow that existed only to serve them. They had stripped her of everything, her family, her education, her dignity. But there was one thing they couldn't take from her, her mind. She refused to break. Every night, after hours of scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and enduring insults, she would drag her exhausted body to the tiny storage room where she slept. Her hands ached, her back throbbed, and her stomach growled from hunger. But instead of collapsing into sleep, she reached under the old wooden crate she used as a table and pulled out a book. It was one of the few things she had managed to save from her past life, one of her school books, hidden away like a secret treasure. She read by the dim light of the moon, tracing the words with her fingers, whispering them softly to herself. She read about mathematics, about science, about great leaders and powerful women who had changed the world. She read about business, about money, about how wealth was built and lost. Every sentence was a small rebellion, a refusal to let them turn her into nothing. She was learning, growing, even in the darkness. But books could only teach so much. Real knowledge, the kind that could set her free, had to come from the world outside. That was where Mama Fadiki came in. Mama Fadiki was a tough, sharp-eyed woman who ran a small shop down the street. She sold everything: spices, fabric, food, even little trinkets that people stopped to admire but rarely bought. She had been watching Zobiana for a long time, noticing the quiet strength in the girl's eyes, the way she carried herself even under the weight of cruelty. One afternoon, as Zobiana was returning from the market, carrying heavy bags for Nekiru, Mama Fadiki stopped her. "Come here, girl," she said, her voice low but firm. Zobiana hesitated. Talking to people outside the house was risky. If Nekiru found out, there would be consequences. But something in Mama Fadiki's eyes told her this wasn't just idle curiosity. "I see you," the older woman said, studying her carefully. "You're not like the others think. You have a brain, and you know how to use it." Zobiana's hands tightened around the bags. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Mama Fadiki glanced around, then leaned in slightly. "Do you want to learn how to survive?" she asked. Zobiana's heart pounded. She knew this was dangerous, but she also knew this was the first real chance she had been given. "Yes," she whispered. And that was how her secret education began. Whenever she had the chance, she would slip away to Mama Fadiki's shop. The woman taught her things no schoolbook ever could: how to bargain, how to read people, how to turn a small amount of money into something bigger. She taught her how to spot opportunities where others saw nothing, how to negotiate, how to make people trust her. "Money is a game," Mama Fadiki told her one evening, as they sat in the back of the shop, counting coins. "The rich know the rules, the poor don't. That's why they stay poor." Zobiana listened carefully, absorbing every word. She practiced what she learned whenever she could, watching how people bought and sold, how businesses worked, how power moved in quiet ways. But knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. She needed money, something of her own, something no one could take from her. And so she started saving. It was almost laughable, the tiny amounts she managed to keep. A few coins here, a few pennies there, whatever she could hide without Nekiru or Zelma noticing. Sometimes, when she was sent to the market, she would buy the cheapest vegetables and keep the extra change. Other times, she would secretly do small tasks for neighbors, washing clothes, running errands, anything that earned her a little money. At night she would take out the small cloth pouch she had hidden under a loose floorboard in the storage room and count her savings. It wasn't much, it wasn't even close to enough, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, Zobiana felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. She didn't know when or how, but she knew one thing for sure: she was going to escape. And when she did, she wouldn't just survive, she would win. Zobiana had endured everything: being treated like a servant in her own home, being robbed of her education, and being forced to beg for scraps, while her stepmother and stepsister lived in luxury. She had swallowed every insult, every slap, every cruel word. But on that night, as she crouched behind the kitchen door, her heart pounding in her chest, she knew she had reached the end. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had finished scrubbing the floors and was on her way back to the tiny storage room where she slept, but something had made her stop when she heard her name. And now she was frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the doorframe, her breath caught in her throat. "I'm tired of feeding that useless girl," Nekiru spat. "She eats and sleeps under my roof, and what do I get? Nothing." "She works," Zelma said lazily, probably picking at her perfectly manicured nails. "She cleans, she cooks. She's not a servant, she's a burden." but not for much longer. Nikiru's voice dropped lower, but Zobiana still heard it. Chief Haruna is looking for a young girl. He's rich, he'll pay well. Zobiana's stomach turned to ice. Chief Haruna, she had heard his name before. An older man, powerful, with a reputation that made even grown women afraid. She won't say no, Zulma asked, amusement in her tone. Nikiru let out a sharp laugh. She doesn't get to say anything. By this time next week, she'll be gone. Zobiana backed away slowly, her entire body trembling. She barely noticed when she reached her tiny room, barely felt her hands moving as she stuffed a few things into a cloth bag. She couldn't stay. If she did, she would be sold like an object, thrown into the hands of a stranger. She had no plan, no money, nowhere to go, but she had no choice. That night, while the house was silent, she slipped out of the back door. Every step felt like a heartbeat, loud and shaky. If Nikiru or Zulma woke up, if the guards saw her, no, she couldn't think about that. She had to move. The streets of Lagos at night were a different world. The city never truly slept, but the bright lights and busy crowds of the day were gone, replaced by shadows and whispers. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, of food being cooked in small roadside stalls. She walked quickly, keeping her head down, clutching her bag tightly. She had never felt more alone. Hours passed, and exhaustion started to creep in. Her feet ached, her stomach growled, but she didn't stop. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. As the sky turned from black to deep blue, she found herself in a part of the city she had never been to before. The streets were lined with small shops, most of them still closed, but a few market women were already setting up for the day. She could hear them talking, laughing, their voices familiar and warm despite the harshness of the morning air. She needed money. She needed food. She hesitated for a long time before approaching an older woman who was sweeping in front of her stall. "Excuse me, ma," she said softly. The woman looked up, frowning slightly. "Yes," Zobiana swallowed her pride. "I'm looking for work. Anything. I can clean. I can carry things." The woman studied her for a moment. Zobiana braced herself for rejection, for suspicion, for questions she didn't know how to answer. Then, with a small sigh, the woman nodded toward a bucket. "You can start by sweeping." Relief flooded her. "Thank you," she whispered, grabbing the broom with trembling hands. She worked all day, scrubbing, sweeping, carrying heavy baskets. The pay was almost nothing, just a few naira and a plate of food, but it was more than she had before. It was something she had earned with her own hands. As night fell, she curled up in a corner behind one of the stalls, using her bag as a pillow. The ground was hard, the air was cold, and her entire body ached. But for the first time in years, she was free. Zobiana had spent weeks sweeping, scrubbing, and carrying heavy baskets in the market. Every muscle in her body ached by the time she collapsed on a sack of rice behind Mama Oza's stall each night. But she never complained. She was free. That alone was enough to keep her going. One afternoon, as she cleaned the front of a large fabric store, she overheard two men arguing about a shipment. One of them, a tall, well-dressed man with sharp eyes, was shaking his head in frustration. "The numbers don't add up," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "If we sell at this price, we'll lose money." Zobiana had always been quick with numbers. Even back when she secretly studied at night, she had a knack for calculations. Without thinking, she spoke. "You need to raise the price slightly for profit. But if you offer a discount for bulk buyers, you'll sell faster and still make money." The man turned to her, surprised. His eyes studied her, her ragged clothes, her tired face. "And who are you?" She hesitated. "Just someone who understands numbers." The other man scoffed. "She's just a market cleaner. What does she know?" But the tall man, Mr. Chukwuma, was intrigued. "Explain," he said, folding his arms. Zobiana took a deep breath. "If you price too low, you won't cover costs. If you price too high, no one will buy. But if you offer discounts on bulk sales, shop owners will rush to buy in large quantities. You'll sell more in a shorter time and still make profit." Mr. Chukwuma's eyes narrowed. "You learned this where?" She hesitated again. If she told the truth, he would never take her seriously. I just pay attention. He was silent for a moment, then smiled. You're smart, wasted as a cleaner. He pulled out a small bundle of naira notes and handed it to her. Come tomorrow, I'll teach you real business. Zobiana stared at the money in shock. It was more than she had ever held in her life. You mean work for you? No, he said. Learn from me. If you're serious, you won't be a cleaner for long. That night, she didn't sleep. She had spent years being treated as worthless, a nobody. But now someone saw her potential. The next morning, she arrived early, heart pounding with excitement. Mr. Chukwuma put her to work immediately, making her sit with his accountants, watch transactions, and memorize price patterns. She absorbed everything like a sponge. Days turned into weeks. She learned how to negotiate, how to understand demand and supply, how to predict what customers would buy before they even knew it themselves. Mr. Chukwuma tested her daily, giving her difficult problems, expecting her to fail. But she never did. You have a gift, he told her one day. You see patterns others don't. She didn't waste a single coin of what she earned. Every night, instead of spending on food, she saved. Soon she had enough to buy a few rolls of cheap fabric. She set up a small stall at the corner of the market, selling to women who couldn't afford expensive cloth. At first, business was slow, but she had learned from Mr. Chukwuma. Know your customers. So she started offering discounts, letting women buy on credit, trusting them to pay later. And they did. They told their friends, and soon her small stall became popular. She reinvested every naira, buying better fabric, expanding her stall, learning which colors and patterns sold best. The other sellers laughed at her in the beginning, but as they watched her little stall grow, their laughter faded. One night, as she counted her earnings, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was winning. Zobiana's small fabric stall became a shop. Then 2. Then 5. Within a few years, she was no longer the girl struggling to survive. She was a businesswoman. Every decision she made was precise. Every move calculated. She reinvested her profits, expanding into high-quality fashion, hiring skilled tailors, and designing exclusive pieces that wealthy clients couldn't resist. Soon, she wasn't just selling fabric, she was setting trends. Fashion weeks in Lagos, Abuja, and even South Africa showcased her designs. Her name echoed in every elite gathering, whispered with admiration and envy. People wanted to know who she was, where she came from, but she never told the full story. The past was behind her, only the future mattered now. But Zobiana wasn't satisfied with just fashion. She saw opportunities everywhere. With the wealth she had accumulated, she entered the real estate world, buying properties in prime locations. She transformed abandoned buildings into luxury apartments, flipping them for enormous profits. Investors lined up, eager to work with her. She was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a mogul. While she built an empire, her stepmother and stepsister lived in blind luxury. Nikiru and Zelma had assumed they would enjoy Chief Obina's wealth forever. They spent recklessly, shopping sprees, vacations, extravagant parties. Zelma, believing herself untouchable, paraded through social events like royalty. Nikiru used Chief Obina's name to secure loans, unaware that the empire they once controlled was crumbling under their feet. One day, Zobiana stood in her high-rise office, gazing out at the Lagos skyline. It still felt unreal. The girl who once scrubbed floors was now signing deals with international investors. The same society that once ignored her now celebrated her. But deep inside, she knew one thing remained unfinished. The people who had cast her aside still lived as if they had won, and Zobiana was about to remind them who the real queen was. Zobiana stepped out of the sleek black car, her heels clicking against the marble pavement of the mansion she once called home. The grand house that once gleamed with wealth now stood dull and lifeless. The walls were cracked, the garden overgrown, and the luxurious cars that once lined the driveway were gone. She took a slow breath, letting the moment sink in. Years ago, she had been thrown out of this house like trash. Today she returned, not as a beggar, but as a billionaire. The door creaked open, and a frail-looking woman stepped out. Nikiru, her stepmother's once proud face was now hollow with stress and age. Her expensive jewelry was gone, replaced by cheap imitations. Behind her, Zelma stood in faded clothes, her beauty dulled by years of struggle. They froze, their eyes widening in shock, as they recognized the woman before them. "Zobiana," Nikiru whispered, as if she had seen a ghost. Zelma took a step back. "It can't be." Zobiana smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Surprised to see me." The silence between them was thick, heavy with guilt and fear. They had assumed she was dead, lost to the streets, forgotten. They never imagined she would return, certainly not like this. Nikiru dropped to her knees, gripping Zobiana's hands. "My daughter, please forgive me. We were wrong. We made mistakes." Zelma's pride crumbled, and she followed her mother, sobbing. "We have nothing left, Zobiana. We lost everything. Father's wealth, the businesses, even this house is about to be taken." Zobiana stared at them, remembering the nights she had gone to bed hungry, the tears she had cried in the dark, the pain of being treated as less than nothing. For years she had dreamed of this moment, of watching them suffer, of seeing them beg just as she once had. But as she looked at them now, weak and broken, she felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just pity. She slowly pulled her hands away. "When I was starving, did you feed me? When I was suffering, did you help me?" Nikiru sobbed harder. "I was blind with greed. I see that now. Please have mercy on us." Zobiana exhaled. She had the power to destroy them, to leave them to rot, just as they had left her. But she wasn't like them. That was the difference. She turned to her assistant, who had been waiting silently. "Transfer ownership of this house to my name, and arrange a small apartment for them." Zelma gasped. You're taking the house." Zobiana met her stepsister's eyes. "It was never yours to begin with." She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "I'm not saving you. I'm just making sure you don't do to someone else what you did to me." And with that, she walked away, not as a victim, not as a servant, but as the woman who had conquered everything. Zobiana stood in the grand living room of the mansion that once belonged to her father. It was hers again, but this time, she wasn't the helpless girl being ordered around. She was the queen of this house, and the very people who once made her a servant were now standing before her, trembling like scared children. Nikiru and Zelma stood in silence, their heads bowed, waiting for their fate. They had expected revenge, expected to be thrown out onto the streets, the same way they had treated her. But Zobiana had other plans. She turned to them, her voice calm but firm. "This house will not be taken away from you. You will stay here." Nikiru gasped in disbelief, her eyes widening with hope. "Oh, Zobiana, you are truly merciful." Zobiana raised a hand, silencing her. "You will stay as housekeepers." The room fell into stunned silence. Zelma's face twisted in horror. "Housekeepers," she choked. "You expect us to clean, to cook, like servants?" Zobiana's eyes met hers, cold and unforgiving. "You had no problem making me do it. Now it's your turn." Nikiru dropped to her knees, her lips trembling. "Please, my daughter, we are too old for this life." Zobiana's gaze hardened. "I am not your daughter." Zelma clenched her fists, her voice filled with desperation. "You have all this wealth. Why can't you just let us live comfortably? Have we not suffered enough?" Zobiana let out a bitter laugh. "Suffered?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You suffered because of your own greed. You took everything from me, and you wasted it. You had your chance at a good life, and you threw it away." Nikiru and Zelma looked around the mansion, once their paradise, now their prison. They had never worked a day in their lives, never imagined they would ever have to. But now, every meal they ate, every moment they spent under this roof, would come at a cost. They would have to work for it, just like Zobiana once did. Zobiana turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "If you don't like the job, the streets are always an option." Neither of them spoke. They knew they had no choice. As Zobiana stepped outside, she felt lighter, free. She hadn't destroyed them, but she had given them exactly what they deserved. Their punishment wasn't losing everything. It was living with the knowledge that they had ruined themselves. But Zobiana wasn't just focused on the past anymore. She had a new purpose. She knew there were many young girls out there, suffering the way she once did, abandoned, mistreated, left to survive on their own. And she wasn't going to let them go through it alone. With her wealth and influence, she created a foundation to help young girls escape toxic homes, giving them shelter, education, and opportunities to build their own futures. She personally mentored many of them, teaching them the same lessons she had learned through pain. The girl who was once treated as a servant was now a respected icon, a force of power, and a savior to many. People spoke of her not just as a billionaire, but as a woman who had turned her suffering into something greater. And as for Nikaru and Zelma, they lived under her rule, reminded every day that they had once held gold in their hands and let it slip away. Zobiana sat on the balcony of her towering mansion, a glass of fresh juice in her hand, as the evening breeze kissed her face. Below her, the city stretched out like a sea of lights, bustling with life, full of dreams, struggles, and victories. This was the same city where she had once wandered homeless, where she had scrubbed market floors just to survive. The same city that had once swallowed her in darkness, now lay beneath her feet. She had conquered it. The world had tried to break her. It had thrown obstacles in her path, stolen her childhood, and pushed her to the edge. But instead of falling, she had risen, higher than anyone ever imagined. She had no powerful family, no safety net, no one to save her. But she had herself, and that was enough. She thought back to the young girl who used to cry herself to sleep. The girl who had begged for kindness and received nothing but cruelty. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had built an empire from dust. A woman who no longer needed validation from anyone. As she watched the city lights flicker like stars, she knew her story wasn't just about wealth or success. It was about survival. About proving that no matter how badly life beats you down, you can always rise. She picked up her phone and recorded a message, not for herself, but for the millions of people out there who felt like she once did. They made me a servant, but I became a billionaire. And if I can rise from nothing, so can you. With that, she put the phone down, smiling as she watched the city. Her battle was over, but for someone else, it was just beginning. And now, they would know that winning was possible. If you loved Zobiana's story, subscribe and like for more inspiring tales.